Professor David Matthews erases the whiteboard in his empty night classroom when suddenly flames engulf everything. Sparks fly from fluorescent lights. Students scream. Smoke chokes the air. He blinks. The room is normal again. But the acrid smell of burning plastic lingers, and the overhead light flickers ominously, as if whispering a terrible warning about what's coming. David Matthews had been teaching night classes at Lincoln Community College in downtown Chicago for 12 years. But he'd never experienced anything like what happened that Tuesday evening in November. The 47-year-old professor of American literature stood frozen in the empty classroom, chalk dust still coating his fingertips from where he'd been erasing the board. The vision had lasted only seconds, but every detail burned in his memory with crystalline clarity. He'd seen the fluorescent light above his desk spark and shower the room with electrical fire. Students had screamed as flames raced across the worn carpet, consuming desks and textbooks in their path. The smell of melting plastic and burning paper had filled his nostrils so vividly that even now, standing in the perfectly normal classroom, he could still taste the acrid smoke. "Get a grip, David," he muttered to himself, but his hands trembled as he gathered his papers. The next morning brought an unseasonably warm day for late November. David arrived at school early, telling himself the vision was just stress manifesting in strange ways. His divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, and the loneliness of his small apartment in Wicker Park had been weighing on him heavily. But as he unlocked his classroom door, the fluorescent light flickered, the same erratic pattern from his vision. His blood ran cold. "Maintenance," he said aloud, forcing rationality into his voice. "Just needs maintenance." During his afternoon prep period, David called the facilities department. "This is Professor Matthews in room 314. My fluorescent light is acting up. We'll get someone over there tomorrow morning," came the bored reply from Jerry, the head custodian he'd known for years. "Actually, could someone come today? It's been sparking." A pause. "Sparking? That's a fire hazard. I'll send Miguel over in an hour." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe this was all a premonition, meant a simple electrical issue that could be fixed before it became dangerous. He'd acted on the warning, changed the course of events. But when Miguel arrived with his toolbox, the light worked perfectly. No flickering. No sparking. "Looks fine to me, Professor," Miguel said, flipping the switch several times. Maybe it was just a loose connection that worked itself out. David nodded, but unease settled in his stomach like a stone. As Miguel left, David remained in the classroom, staring up at the innocent-looking light fixture. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. That evening, as David prepared for his 7 p.m. contemporary fiction class, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something more abstract, as if fate itself was observing his every move, waiting to see if he would step into the trap he'd foreseen. David's night class was unusually full, that Thursday 18 students instead of the typical dozen. The extra bodies made the room feel warmer, and David found himself loosening his tie as he discussed the themes in Toni Morrison's Beloved. The past doesn't stay buried in Morrison's work, David explained, writing key points on the whiteboard. It resurfaces in unexpected ways, often when we least expect it. As he spoke, he noticed the fluorescent light above his desk begin its familiar flicker. His heart rate spiked, but he forced himself to continue teaching. Several students glanced up at the light, but no one seemed particularly concerned. "Professor Matthews?" asked Chun, a pre-med student in the front row. "Are you okay? You look pale." David realized he'd stopped mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on the light fixture. "I'm fine. Just, where were we?" "You were talking about the past surfacing unexpectedly," said Marcus, a veteran student in his 30s who always sat in the back. The irony wasn't lost on David. He glanced at the clock, 8:15 p.m. In his vision, the fire had started around 8:30, When most students would normally be packing up for the 10-minute break, he always gave before the final hour of class. "Let's take our break now," David announced suddenly, 15 minutes early. Students exchanged glances, but began gathering their things for the usual trip to the vending machines and restrooms. As they filed out, chattering about weekend plans and upcoming assignments, David remained at his desk, watching the fluorescent light. The moment the last student left, the light began sparking, exactly as he'd seen in his vision. Small electrical fires dropped onto his desk, igniting the stack of ungraded essays he'd left there. "Fire!" David shouted, grabbing the small extinguisher from near the door. The chemical spray quickly doused the flames, but the acrid smell filled the room just as he'd experienced in his premonition. When students began returning from break, they found David opening windows and waving papers to clear the air. "What happened?" Sarah asked, wrinkling her nose at the smell. "Minor electrical issue," David said, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "I think we should call it a night. The building maintenance needs to check this out." As students gathered their belongings and left, several expressing concern for their professor's well-being, David felt a mixture of triumph and dread. He'd prevented the vision from coming true, exactly as he'd seen it, but something told him this wasn't over. Miguel arrived within 20 minutes of David's call, accompanied by an electrician named Pete, who wore a Chicago Bears cap and carried a voltage tester. "Definitely a short in the ballast," Pete confirmed after examining the fixture. "Good thing you caught it early. This could have been much worse." They replaced the entire light fixture, and Pete assured David it was now completely safe. But as David finally locked up the classroom at nearly 10 p.m., he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The new fluorescent light flickered once, just once, as he turned to leave. Over the next week, David found himself obsessing over every detail of that night. He'd prevented the fire exactly as he'd foreseen it, yet the brief flicker of the new light suggested his ordeal wasn't over. He began researching premonitions online, falling down rabbit holes of paranormal websites and scientific studies about precognitive experiences. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. Story after story described people who'd had visions of disasters, only to find that avoiding one danger led to another, as if some cosmic force was determined to maintain a specific outcome. "You're losing it, David," he told himself Tuesday morning as he sat in his favorite coffee shop in Lincoln Park, nursing his third espresso. The barista, a young woman with purple hair named Zoe, had already asked if he was feeling all right. "Just working on a new lesson plan," he'd lied. But as he sat there, laptop open to an article about destination theory and final destination syndrome, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Not the other customers. He checked discreetly several times. Something else. Something patient. His phone buzzed. A text from the school administration office. "Faculty meeting moved to room 314 at 3 p.m. today. Thanks, Jennifer." Room 314, his classroom. David's hands trembled as he typed back. "Can we use a different room? My classroom has been having electrical issues." The response came quickly. "All other rooms booked. Maintenance says 314 is fine now. See you at 3. David stared at the message, dread pooling in his stomach. It was as if he was being drawn back to the scene, pulled by invisible strings towards some predetermined fate. At 2:45 p.m., David reluctantly made his way to his classroom. The new fluorescent light hummed normally overhead, casting steady white light across the empty desks. He arranged chairs in a circle for the meeting and tried to tell himself he was being paranoid. His colleagues began arriving. Dr. Patricia Wells from the psychology department, Professor James Crawford from history, and 5 others from various departments. Jennifer Martinez, the department coordinator, carried a stack of papers about the upcoming accreditation review. "Thanks for hosting, David," Jennifer said, taking a seat directly under the new light fixture. "I know you've had some issues with the room lately." "All fixed now," David replied, but kept glancing up at the light. 20 minutes into the meeting, as Professor Crawford was explaining new documentation requirements, the lights in the entire building suddenly went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie red shadows across the room. "Power outage," Jennifer announced unnecessarily. "Let's give it a few minutes." But David's enhanced senses heightened by days of paranoid vigilance caught something his colleagues missed, a faint smell of burning insulation coming from somewhere in the walls. The same smell from his vision, but subtler, more insidious. "We should leave," David said suddenly, standing up. "It's just a power outage, David," Dr. Wells said gently. "The emergency system will have everything back up in a few minutes." "No, I smell something burning. We need to evacuate now." His colleagues exchanged concerned glances. David realized how he must sound paranoid, possibly unstable. But the smell was getting stronger, and now he could hear a faint crackling from somewhere behind the walls. "David's right," Professor Crawford said suddenly. "I smell it too. Old building like this, electrical fire in the walls could spread fast." That was all the confirmation the group needed. They quickly gathered their things and headed for the exit, David ushering them out with barely controlled urgency. As they reached the hallway, David heard it, the sound from his vision. A sharp electrical pop, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames catching. By the time the fire department arrived, room 314 was completely engulfed. The fire investigation concluded that faulty wiring behind the walls had caused the blaze wiring that was completely separate from the light fixture David had been so worried about. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been watching for danger from above while it grew silently behind the walls. "You saved our lives," Dr. Wells told him the next morning as they stood in the parking lot, looking up at the blackened windows of what had been his classroom. "How did you know?" David didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound insane. Lucky guess. But luck had nothing to do with what was happening to him. Over the next few days, as the school arranged temporary classrooms and David continued his night classes in the library conference room, he began to notice a pattern that chilled him to the bone. Every close call seemed to be steering him towards something specific. The original vision had shown flames in his classroom, but preventing that had led to the faculty meeting, which had led to him being in the building during the electrical fire. He'd escaped again, but each escape felt less like victory and more like being hurted. The breaking point came on Friday evening. David was walking to his car after his night class when he noticed a man in a dark coat following him through the parking garage. The stranger stayed about 20 feet back, matching David's pace perfectly. David's paranoia, now finely tuned after a week of escalating incidents, screamed danger. He ducked between two cars and waited, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped. Carefully, David peered around a concrete pillar. The man was gone. "Get a grip," David whispered to himself, but his hands were shaking as he unlocked his car. As he backed out of his parking space, David glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the man again, now standing near the garage entrance. Their eyes met in the mirror, and David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. Instead of heading home to his apartment, David drove aimlessly through Chicago's South Side, taking random turns and checking his mirrors obsessively. No one followed him, but the feeling of being hunted persisted. He finally stopped at an all-night diner on Archer Avenue, a place called Mel's that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The fluorescent lights inside were old, and flickering nothing like the ones that had caused his classroom fire, but the similarity made him nervous. "Coffee, hon?" asked the waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and tired feet. "Please, and maybe some pie? Apple or cherry?" "Apple." David chose randomly, his mind elsewhere. As he sat in the cracked vinyl booth, stirring sugar into his coffee, David tried to piece together what was happening to him. The visions, the near misses, the growing sense that he was being pushed toward some inevitable conclusion. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he could not quite solve. The diner's radio played soft jazz, interrupted occasionally by weather reports. A storm was moving in from the west, bringing heavy snow and dangerous driving conditions. The kind of storm that caused accidents. David's blood ran cold. In all his focus on fires and electrical hazards, he'd never considered other types of dangers. He paid for his coffee and pie barely touched and headed back into the night. The first snowflakes were already falling as he reached his car, and the wind was picking up. Weather reports had been calling for a major storm, the kind that made headlines when it hit cities unprepared for its fury. As David drove carefully through the increasingly heavy snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that this storm wasn't random. Nothing had been random since his first vision. Everything was connected, part of some larger design that was finally revealing itself. By midnight, the snowstorm had transformed Chicago into a treacherous maze of ice and blinding white. David sat in his Wicker Park apartment, watching through his window as the storm intensified beyond anything the weather service had predicted. The power flickered intermittently, and each time it did, David's heart rate spiked. He'd been pacing his small living room for hours, unable to shake the feeling that the storm was somehow meant for him. Every gust of wind against his windows, every creak of the old building settling under the weight of accumulating snow, felt like a countdown to something final. His phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Extreme weather warning. Avoid all non-essential travel. Multiple accidents reported on major highways. David's hands trembled as he read the message. Accidents, of course. All the fires and electrical hazards had been red herrings, distracting him from the real danger. But how could he avoid a storm that seemed to be following him? A sharp crack outside made him jump. Through the swirling snow, he could see that a large branch from the oak tree in his building's courtyard had snapped under the weight of ice. It lay across the walkway where he would normally pass when leaving for work. Another trap, David whispered to himself. He checked his phone for the time. 12:47 AMA. His Saturday morning contemporary American poetry class wasn't until 10 MN, but something told him he wouldn't be safe staying in the apartment. The storm was intensifying, and old buildings like his weren't built to withstand this kind of weather. As if summoned by his thoughts, the power went out completely. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the pale glow of snow through the windows. David fumbled for his phone's flashlight and made his way to his emergency kit, a habit he'd developed since the classroom fire. In the beam of his phone light, David noticed something that made his blood freeze. The ceiling above his bed was sagging slightly, dark stains spreading across the white paint. Snow was accumulating on the roof faster than the building's drainage could handle, and water was seeping through. David grabbed his coat and keys. Whatever was hunting him had found him here in his own home. He had to keep moving. The hallway of his building was pitch black and eerily quiet. Most of his neighbors were probably asleep, trusting that morning would bring relief from the storm. But David knew better now. He'd learned to recognize the signs when death was closing in. Outside, the storm was apocalyptic. Snow fell so heavily that David could barely see 10 feet ahead. His car was buried under nearly 2 feet of accumulation, and the streets were completely impassable. Even if he could dig out his car, driving would be suicide. But staying wasn't an option either. Through the swirling snow, David could see emergency vehicles in the distance, their red and blue lights painting the white landscape in ominous colors. Something had happened, another accident caused by the storm. David pulled out his phone to call for help, but the cell towers were down. No service. He was completely alone in the storm, with nowhere to go and no way to call for assistance. That's when he remembered the school. Lincoln Community College was only 6 blocks away, and the main building had emergency power and heating. If he could make it there on foot, he might be able to wait out the storm safely. The walk through the blizzard was the most terrifying experience of David's life. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow into his eyes and making each step treacherous. Twice he slipped on hidden ice, nearly falling into the street where abandoned cars sat buried like snow-covered tombs. But he made it. The college's main building loomed out of the storm like a sanctuary, its emergency lights cutting through the darkness. David used his faculty keycard to enter through the side entrance, grateful for the blast of warm air that greeted him. The building was eerily quiet, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows down the empty corridors. David made his way to the faculty lounge on the second floor, planning to wait out the storm on one of the couches there. But as he climbed the stairs, he heard something that stopped him cold. The familiar flicker and hum of fluorescent lights coming from somewhere above. Room 314 was supposed to be gutted and closed off after the fire. But light was leaking from under the door, and David could hear the electrical buzz that had haunted his nightmares for weeks. David stood frozen on the stairway, staring at the thin line of light beneath the door of room 314. The door that should have been sealed, the room that should have been destroyed. Yet there it was, glowing with the familiar fluorescent light that had started everything. His rational mind offered explanations. Emergency crews working on repairs, temporary lighting for investigation purposes. But David's enhanced intuition, sharpened by weeks of dodging death, knew better. This was the moment everything had been building toward. With trembling hands, David climbed the remaining stairs and approached the door. The nameplate still read, D. Matthews, American Literature, though it should have been removed after the fire. He pressed his ear to the door and heard something that made his heart stop. The soft murmur of student voices, as if class were in session. The door handle turned easily in his grip. Inside, room 314 was exactly as it had been before, the fire desks arranged in their familiar pattern. Whiteboard clean and ready for use, his teaching materials organized on the desk. But it wasn't empty. 18 students sat in the desks, the same 18 from that night weeks ago when he'd first had his vision. Professor Matthews, Sarah Chan said with a smile, looking up from her notebook. "We were waiting for you." David's legs nearly gave out. This isn't possible. The room ... it burned. "You weren't supposed to be here." "But we are here," Marcus said from the back row, his voice gentle but somehow final. "We've been waiting for you to teach us the last lesson." The fluorescent light above David's desk flickered, not the dangerous electrical sparking he'd feared, but a gentle, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. Or like breathing, the light of something alive, something patient. "I don't understand," David whispered. "You've been running from the wrong thing," said another student, a young man David remembered as particularly insightful during class discussions. "You thought death was chasing you. But death was never your enemy, Professor. Fear was." David looked around his classroom, and saw it clearly for the first time in weeks. There were no scorch marks on the walls, no smell of smoke, no signs of the destruction he'd witnessed. Just a room where learning happened, where minds grew, where the past and future met in the eternal present of education. "The vision," David said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. It wasn't a warning about fire. It was about endings. About the fear of endings preventing us from embracing the moments we have. Sarah nodded encouragingly. "You spent so much time running from death that you forgot to live. But now you're here, with us, ready for the final lesson." David walked to his desk, his fear replaced by a strange sense of peace. The whiteboard behind him was no longer blank. Words had appeared, written in his own handwriting. "Every ending is also a beginning. What is the lesson?" David asked his students, though he suspected he already knew. "That some things can't be outrun or outsmarted," Marcus replied. "They can only be accepted with grace." The fluorescent light pulsed brighter, warmer. No longer the harsh institutional glare David had always disliked, but something gentler, more welcoming, like the light at the end of a very long tunnel. David picked up a piece of chalk and turned to the whiteboard. For the first time in weeks, his hands were steady. "Let's begin tonight's lesson," he said to his students, his voice calm and sure. Outside the windows of room 314, the storm continued to rage, but inside the classroom, all was peaceful. The fluorescent light hummed contentedly, no longer flickering with electrical problems, but pulsing in rhythm with something deeper. The quiet heartbeat of acceptance, of a story finally reaching its natural conclusion. As David wrote on the whiteboard, explaining the profound beauty found in life's most difficult passages, the light above grew gradually brighter, calling him forward into whatever lesson awaited beyond the classroom walls. The chalk fell from his fingers like snow, and David Matthews learned that the most important truths can only be taught in the quiet moments, when we finally stop running and allow ourselves to understand. In the morning, they would find the building empty and dark, the storm having passed. But those who knew how to look might notice that sometimes, late at night when the building settles and the old fluorescent lights remember their purpose, room 314 still glows with the gentle light of a lesson that never truly ends.